From Flourish DX, this is the Psych Health and Safety Canada podcast, with workplace mental health becoming a priority for businesses who want to retain staff and prevent burnout. This is the source of information for creating sustainable and psychologically healthy workplaces in Canada.
Welcome to the Psych Health and Safety podcast in Canada. And today I have a tag team that are here to inform and inspire us. We have Kristin Bauer and Annika Lofstrand from Leda HR. Is that how you say that?
Yeah, you nailed it.
Great, thank you. So we will jump in and get started. And the first question that I have for both of you is thinking back to when you first heard about psych health and safety. How did it happen and what did you think? So Kristin, can we start with you?
Sure, yeah. Well, we've both worked in human resources for over 20 years. So we were always drawn to this idea actually of healthy, inclusive workplaces, even before we were talking about some of this terminology. And for me, how I really came to be aware of this concept was not only am I an HR person, but I'm also a person who has lived with chronic and recurring depression. So I was always kind of trying to reconcile my career as an HR person and also as just a human being struggling with depression and trying to keep in the workplace and noticing some connections, drawing some connections. But I will say that where it really became evident to me was the launch of the national standard on psychological health and safety in the workplace. And that's when I kind of went, oh, yeah, especially when you look at the 13 psychosocial factors.
Yeah, and really understand all the things that impact you, whether you have a mental illness or you don't. Exactly. Annika, what were your earliest exposures to psych health and safety?
Yeah, thanks, Marianne. The last time I was in-house in an organization was actually 8 years ago. So that was around the time that the national standard was being created. So I did not have the benefit of knowing about it or understanding it, but I was a director accountable for talent management and in essence, the workplace culture, that it was welcoming, inclusive, and respectful. So I think this standard would have really helped to put a framework around that. So it was more difficult, I would say, than it has been for Kristin and I in our consulting, where we can link it to some great research, to something that's originated in Canada, and the research is just supporting us even further to have these conversations with organizations now. So I would say it was harder, Marianne, in the early days to have the buy-in around why this is important, both for business and, for the employee experience.
Well, and that's been my experience, Annika, is that many people like yourselves that already had that concept that work should be a healthy place, work should be a safe place, that's better for business. We're dancing in the dark because it sounded like that you just, were those touchy-feely people that, there really wasn't any connection to it. But I also want to tap into a little bit more of your expertise around inclusivity, which of course is really near and dear to my heart as well, and ask if you can make some of the links between inclusivity and psych health and safety.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because now if I do reflect back to when I first looked at the standard and those 13 psychosocial factors, as an HR person, I went through that list and I thought, oh my gosh, well, this is actually just good HR practice, really. Because I think people hear that standard and they think it's just about mental health. Well, it's about a lot of things. And so, when we're talking about inclusive organizations and in the context that we work, it's, inclusion of diversity and working to create equitable workplaces. Because there is, of course, a human case for it, but there's also a really strong business imperative as well. And so, creating or focusing on psychological health and safety enables leaders in particular to be able to really step up and lead, to really lean into, I used a cliched term there, but lean into building trusting relationships with their direct reports so that they can sure, do the fun stuff, but also to be able to have some of those hard conversations when they need to as well. I've lost your sound.
Thank you. You brought up a common misconception, which is that a lot of people think the standard on psychological health and safety is about people with mental illness.
Yeah.
And, the analogy I use is we don't take chemicals out of the air only for people with asthma. We take it out for everybody. But you said it's a lot of other things. Can you just expand a bit on some of the other things? Leadership you talked about. What else does the standard cover?
Yeah. So, I mean, everything from, your like civility and respect, for example. So, we work a lot with clients when we're reviewing, for example, a respectful workplace policy. And because we are equity, diversity, and inclusion consultants, it's not just the HR perspective, it's the diversity and the equity and the inclusion perspective that we're really focused on. And so when you consider that, something like civility and respect in the workplace, it's not just, it shouldn't just be compliance driven. Oh, we have to have this respectful workplace policy. We have to do the annual training. Everybody hates it. They do it like in the 11th hour on December 30th, just to check the box. Why aren't we having more conversations around how this actually is good for all of us? And why wouldn't we want to, really embrace this shared accountability about what it is to create, a really healthy workplace in the full sense of it? And so when Annika and I are doing our training and speaking with clients, we say, we still haven't come up with like a really fun, cool, term for it, but it's almost like respectful workplace 2.0. It's not just thou shalt not. It's about, hey, if we all do these things, this is what our environment could be like. And it's good for our mental health. And of course, mental health, just like any health, is a spectrum. Some days you're feeling top of the world, other days you're not feeling so great. But, when you start to look at things like recognition and reward, how we interact with each other, what about this idea of really clear leadership? Brene Brown has this quote that I think is so well known: clear is kind, unclear is unkind. So how do we speak clearly to people in a way that's respectful, and that, helps to really foster, we can double down on what it is to create a really healthy, respectful workplace? Because that inclusion and the belonging, who cares if you have a diverse organization? If you don't have the equity and the inclusion and the belonging, you're not going to get all that other good stuff if you don't have, the inclusion and the belonging.
Yeah. Annika, Kristin said about being able to speak up respectfully. And a lot of people are afraid to have what is actually a psychologically safe organization because people will speak up and they're afraid that it's going to cause more problems than it's going to solve. How do you deal with that issue?
Yeah, thanks, Marianne. And that is, I'm so glad you raised that, because we really lean into one of the psychosocial factors Kristin just mentioned around clear leadership and expectations. And we've been really pleased to see, I'll speak for myself, some leaders talk about their fear around what you just said, right? What is that going to create, right? Is it going to, will a non-performer invoke this, right? Will it be, coddling or overprotecting? Will there be a lack of accountability if everyone brings their full self to work and can speak up on any issue? And we feel so strongly, this is where our HR backgrounds help us, is in society. I don't know if Kristin and I would be the right people to comment on how do you create this in community, but we certainly know something about how to create it within organizations. There's a structure for a reason. It shouldn't be hierarchy for hierarchy's sake. Mm-hmm. Leaders are not going to be undermined or in a bad position if they create this inclusive environment. But we really have to encourage that and walk them through it, because there is some fear of what they will lose control of if everyone can speak up. And that we respectfully approach it again without judgment, with curiosity of why do they feel that way and what is the actual risk, and what would be the harm in trying this. And we've seen some really positive examples of where people have been vulnerable, role modeled this behavior, and have an even more high performing team than they did before they were afraid to take this on.
Yeah, excellent. And Kristin, so there are people in the workplace that are angry and negative and critical. And is that what Annika's talking about? Let's give them more voice.
Oh, well, not really. I mean, it's interesting because we were just doing, we did an 1.5-hour workshop yesterday with an executive leadership team and their board members. And so it's fresh in mind or top of mind because the CEO really was modeling some wonderful inclusive behaviors, because he said, I'm really nervous about this heightened awareness that employees have about what's going on in the world. And of course, that old barrier or line between work life and home life has been forever blurred, because so many, of us are working from home now. So you can't just leave things at the door, nor should you necessarily. There are a lot of things we do need to talk about, and why not in the workplace. But he said, I'm just really nervous because, how do we respond to things? Employees say to us, you haven't commented on this issue in the world. Why haven't you? Or if they do comment on it, you said the wrong thing, you did the wrong thing, you reacted too slowly. And, so we had this really great discussion about this, about, you're going to have there are heightened expectations. We saw that with, the horrific death of George Floyd. Employees were like, we need to take a stand on this. So employers put the black box on social media. There we stand with, Black Lives Matter. And then employees said, a month or 2 or 6 months later, okay, well, but what have we done since then? So there's a higher accountability, right? Which is, I think, a good thing, and we need to be able to have discourse about these things. But there are also going to be, in every organization, there are going to be people who see the world through a certain, I see the world through my lenses. And they are going to be disgruntled about whatever it is. They think that their performance review was unfair, or their manager's bullying them, but, the manager's really just performance managing them. So I think that, when we start to talk to leaders about, psychological health and safety, how to have hard conversations, how to be curious, how to listen rather than, think you have to have all the answers. It just makes it easier to have a lot of hard conversations, whatever those conversations are.
Yeah, thank you. Annika, is it all on leaders? Is psychological health and safety all the responsibility of leaders, or do employees have any responsibility to be psychologically safe?
Yeah, I like that question, Marianne. I mean, I would suggest that there is an element of peer-to-peer and of personal leadership. I think when we talk about leadership, we're thinking of both, Kristin and I, is positional and personal. How we all show up and what that accountability is, because we all have an impact. So that being said, is we do 2 things around the work we do with leaders. Is we really try to create a space where we use the term sometimes your oxygen mask on first. Like, where is there a place for them to learn, to lean in, to be vulnerable, to admit what they don't know? And this is definitely a subject where it is new terminology still, Marianne, for a lot of leaders. They've not heard of the national standard. When we start to describe it to them, like, oh, yes, I'm aware of that concept, but not this terminology. So yes and no is the answer to it. Is yes, I think there's an accountability on everyone in an organization to create an experience and to support a workplace culture. But leaders have a unique accountability because they can give permission in a different way. They can role model certain behaviors. So when we are at our best, we're sometimes able to do something with maybe leaders and employees together. But there's also this component, whether it's a leader's toolkit, a discussion guide, something we can give them to build their competence, capacity, and confidence around this.
That's a point that I strongly agree with you. When we talk about psych health and safety, many folks want to rush to survey to see what the employees think and then tell the managers, the leaders, what they're doing wrong. And I feel very strongly that we need to help support the leaders' success, help set them up for success before we start to engage the employees. Because it's not fair if we've never asked our managers to lead in a certain way, in a psychologically safe way. If they're not sure what that is, then why are we measuring them to say you failed? So yeah. That
well, and that ties into, Marianne, with what you just said, ties into this classic mistake in organizations, which is an individual contributor is excellent at role X. So let's promote them to be a manager, but let's not give them any of the skills training or the tools that they need to now, effectively lead employees. So I agree. I mean, this is something Annika and I feel so strongly about and we encourage our clients, for example, if they're going to do a suite of learning opportunities, we get a session in with the managers early on, right? Because they need to be able to feel supported. Their psych health and safety matters too. So how do we support them to be able to support their employees?
When I was asked to be a Cub Scout leader, I said, I don't know anything about scouting. Like, how am I going to do that? And the guy that was asking me said, you just have to be one day smarter than the kids. So you learn it and then you teach it, which is great because we can anticipate it. With a leader, you can't anticipate what they need tomorrow or even today. So if you had the ability to choose the skills that a brand new leader should start with, what would you be teaching them?
I'm going to jump in on this one, Annika. Empathy and curiosity. We have found, and I speak for myself here, curiosity for me has been transformational. Because, and this ties in with unconscious bias, we all have it. Our brains are wired in a certain way. And so we naturally go to a place of judgment about things. Oh, that person did that, therefore this. And what I noticed a few years ago for myself, because Annika and I really try to model what we, or live what we tell other people to do, I really started to challenge myself around curiosity and why was I having reactions to things? Either really strongly good or bad or indifferent. Why was I reacting? And to be able to catch myself when I went to a place of judgment and kind of pause, even just for like a moment, think, why am I feeling this way? What don't I know about this situation? What might be going on for this person? Just to take a little breath there has been really transformational for me. And it's helped me shift from that automatic, the automatic shortcuts that my brain does. And I know that it can be really transformational for leaders because we do make assumptions about people, how they act. And if you've got an employee who might be struggling with a mental health issue, if we want to talk about mental health specifically for a minute, those symptoms can show up in ways in the workplace where we think, well, it's bad behavior. So now I need to discipline them. No, you don't. You need to be curious about why your employee is showing up that way. And then the empathy piece is just crucial. And I think that the world is just, not to get too Pollyanna-ish, but if we could be more empathetic just in general in the world, trying to, imagine what that other person is going through, it builds bridges rather than, shuts conversations down.
So what you're really describing is emotional intelligence. But
yes.
I always say psychopaths and sociopaths can have high levels of emotional intelligence. It's how do we apply it? And to apply it from a lens of curiosity and empathy versus manipulation and control is the difference. Excellent. So Annika, what about you? What would you say in addition to empathy and curiosity? What do you think is most important for new leaders to learn?
Just one comment, Marianne. When Kristin was speaking, I'm thinking about, even our time in HR, just watching the evolution of the description of good leadership. And Marianne, you probably remember is competency models, right? That where organizations were identifying those top competencies. And sometimes these softer skills were embedded. Sometimes they were called out. Sometimes they weren't anywhere. and then there was a definition and you might be assessed on it when you became a leader. There'd be levels within it. And some of those definitions were quite colonial and flawed in all sorts of ways. So I echo what Kristin says with the caveat of, not defining them to a point where you're dictating them to people. So what I think has been amazing and powerful, what I've seen is organizations that are thinking about learning paths for individuals and for people leaders, where there's a safe place for some self-awareness. Then there's a time when you can think about, now, what does this mean when I lead a team? What does this mean for me in this organization? Context is so important. So even if the organization doesn't have it, if Kristin and I get the opportunity to work even with an individual, we'll often break it into those pieces. What is the part about self? What could help you become more self-aware, right? Of your biases, your ways of thinking and being, perceptions and assumptions. Now you lead a team. What kind of team do you lead? How often do you meet with them? What's the work that you do? And then in your organization, what do you understand? How is this aligned to your mission, vision, values? How does it show up there? And what's your role going to be in that? So feels more personalized, but in a really good way. Like situational leadership has always been, we've thought, good leadership. So unless you know the situation, sometimes we're just that bridge that helps a leader or a team talk that through.
You're just bringing me back to my days of learning about adult education. That you can send somebody to a workshop and they'll come back and they might remember a few little things.
Yeah.
The chances of them applying it are very low.
Yeah.
So you're not changing behaviors. You might be entertaining and having thoughts provoked. But when you say to them, you're going to this training or workshop, and I expect you to come back and tell me how you're going to apply it. And then you hold them accountable to apply it. It's a completely different learning experience, but it is also how the work that people like yourselves do change behaviors rather than just take up time, right? So obviously that's what you're talking about. But I think the piece that you expanded on is that when the learning is in context to their experience to begin with, rather than a cookie cutter approach to learning, it's much easier for them to think about how they're going to apply it. So yeah, that's fascinating.
And Marianne, that's sorry, I'll just add that's been a critical success factor for us in talking about the psychosocial factors and psychological health and safety. Otherwise, it is a national standard. It's that bridge to what does it mean to you in your organization? And all 13 psychosocial factors won't resonate the same. For some are harder to understand for people. But if we can pick, a couple and have a leader individually or a team kind of talk through which civility and respect, for example, in relation to their respectful workplace policy, and compel them, like Kristin said, what's the opportunity as opposed to the issues you want to mitigate and the risk that you want to mitigate. So that's really transformational. Then they're on a journey. But this in and of itself, if you just gave it to them, I could appreciate how they might feel overwhelmed. What is it and how do I implement it?
Yeah. Overwhelmed, disconnected, and that it's not relevant, right? But to be able to have that help to say, this is what it looks like and feels like in your workplace. I had the experience years ago, probably, I guess, 10 years ago, where a group that did health and safety said, we'd like you to talk about each of the psychosocial factors from the lens of ergonomics.
Oh,
I was like, what? You want me to do what? And then I started to, because I love a challenge. So I started to get into it and realized that wherever people interact with their environment, with their equipment, with each other, psych health and safety is there, right? And so it was possible. I did do it, but it was quite the challenge. And so I'm really glad that there are people like yourselves out there making that difference. So let's talk a little bit about that. So you're talking to a very blue collar resource, energy mining, construction industry. Tell me the language that you use to introduce the concepts of inclusivity and psychological health and safety?
Well, that's a good question. And I might say it's not necessarily always the language, it's maybe how we approach it or our style,
Mhm.
and it's, I think it makes me reflect back on just the fact that Annika and I have worked in HR for over 20 years is we've always been in a service role. We're always working with clients. And so it's important that I guess I'll go back to the emotional intelligence. We kind of read the room, like who are we working with? How do we need to how do we need to speak to them? And not just even in the language. So, I think it's important, like what we've noticed is that when we make an assumption about a particular group or audience, we can easily be wrong.
Mhm.
So it kind of goes back to the curiosity thing. So we worked with North Island College, was it a year ago or 2 years ago? And they had a pilot program for the film and TV industry in British Columbia. And they wanted us to design and deliver sort of that respectful workplace 2.0, workshop. And we weren't sure what it was going to be like because it was adult education. It was in the evening. Who were the people that we were going to see? And that turned out to be one of the most engaging groups. And so I think, and I will say, I think with Annika and I, our style is like we always say to people at the start, we're not trainers, we're facilitators. We want to create dialogue. And so interrupt us, poke at these ideas, pull them apart. Let's be curious. And so whether it's, like the group we were with yesterday, like the board and executive leadership team, or if it's, people who are doing blue collar work, let's just try to demystify all of this stuff. Let's approach it as human beings. And, so I don't know if that really answers your question,
It
Marianne.
absolutely does, is that
Okay.
you engage people in a conversation, and so you can
Yeah.
respond as it's going.
Yeah.
You don't, yes, but it's a phrase in my training, which is start where the client's at, right?
Exactly. Yes,
Yeah.
that's exactly what I'm trying to say in fewer words.
And Marianne, I love what Kristin said about checking our own assumptions. I think that's been, one of the things we hope we bring to our clients is that as consultants, at one time we were in-house in an organization accountable for equity, diversity, and inclusion, whatever that meant at that organization at that time. We understand how difficult it is to, let's call it, operationalize this, right? Because it is about culture, it is about employee experience. So we certainly have humility from what we were tasked with. So when we bring that to organizations, and each year that we continue in our consulting, I love to be surprised, Marianne. So yesterday, the group that we were working with, without naming them, it was someone in the group that offered, and I'll just paraphrase, that said, look, we're engineers. Maybe we think in a more binary way. And then he went on to explain what that meant to him. I think that wouldn't have been fair for us to assume anything about the fact that they're in engineering and how that relates to workplace culture and psych safety. And then the opposite can be true. We can work with agile entrepreneurial startups or not-for-profits, and we can make an assumption of what might resonate more or less with them and be wrong. So it is absolutely a meet people where they're at. And I loved what you said about that they're left with something they can apply. Mm-hmm. And that for us is success, because these topics can be very interesting to explore and leave people not knowing what to do next.
Yeah, for sure. Now, I'm really curious. I'd love for you to describe for me what the attempt was when you were in-house and how that's evolved to the approach that you take today. What have you learned? How has your practice changed in terms of inclusivity?
Inclusivity, yeah. Well, certainly things have evolved, and I would say, the pandemic and the horrific death of George Floyd were two things that really, I know every EDI consultant, the day after George Floyd was murdered, our email inboxes just exploded. So, and it hasn't let up. And now with the pandemic, just after 2 years, people are realizing we need to keep moving forward. We need to keep focusing on people. So when I reflect back, and it's interesting because I was just speaking with somebody last week who is in the organization now, leading work, the organization now that I had been in prior to becoming a consultant. So there I was the manager of diversity and inclusion. And one of the areas that I was working to push a rock up a hill, and not even a rock, but a boulder, was around mental health. And it was people just, they sort of wanted to talk about it, but they sort of didn't. Leaders are really unsure because they thought, well, I care about it, but I don't want to talk about it because I might do or say the wrong thing. I don't feel supported. I don't know how to have these conversations. And so last week I was speaking with this person, and our time there didn't overlap. And I'd never met her before, just on social media. And she reached out and she said, hey, you know, I know you did a lot of this work before you left, and let's just talk. And I was so excited to hear of the shift. You know, this organization now is putting all of their leaders through training for mental health. They put a lot of their employees through training for mental health first aid. And so there's much more of a conversation, a larger conversation happening around what is inclusion and what is the role of the leader to create an inclusive and equitable workplace. So it goes back to that idea that we were just talking about how do we support leaders to be able to do the right thing and to feel, you know, they've got the supports to do it. So we've seen a shift, but we also still see a lot of leaders are really uncomfortable about this new way of working where we lean into curiosity. And it's okay if you say to your team, I don't have it all figured out, you know, like this idea of authenticity and vulnerability. These are new things that leaders feel a bit uncomfortable with if it doesn't come naturally.
Well, and so I think what you've described is we've gone from, okay, you have to support people who have mental illness, to we need to support you for your comfort level and your ability to do that, which is a great shift. Annika, what have you seen
wonderful
as the big differences?
Thanks, Marianne. I'm hoping this might be helpful to your listeners, because it's certainly something I learned on the job and did not do perfectly well. I will own that. It was 18 years ago when I started at that organization that I mentioned, that I was there for a decade. I had the benefit of starting as an individual contributor and ending as a director. One thing that I think helped was within my talent management portfolio, EDI was one component. So rather than a standalone, I could look at how could it be embedded into those talent systems, so that it was, you know, balancing that head and heart, and really getting some traction on it. But the piece that I've really learned, and certainly Kristin and I take to other organizations, is there appears to be a systems piece to this. Policies, practices, processes that either support equity and inclusion or they don't, right? They present barriers to some, not to others. So yes, you've got to look at your systems. If you only do that, you've missed the mindset, the behaviors, the buy-in, the change management, the leadership, all of that. We never know in an organization which lever we need to pull more or less of until we get in and ask some questions. But in hindsight, when I think of what I've learned as a leader, I was young in my leadership career, so I wouldn't have framed it that way. It's been in hindsight as I've learned that both of those are always at play, the systems and the behaviors. And if you're willing to explore both, you know, and make those changes in both and have a bit of a path, none of it happens overnight. That's when you start to see the meaningful, sustainable change.
Well, and you know, you bring up another great point, Annika, is the idea of let's change the policy, let's change the programs, let's change the, the instructions to people. Yeah. But really, psych health and safety and inclusion is in the day-to-day interactions, and yet a lot of the big projects, the big initiatives that people do never get at that. How are we talking to each other? How are we interacting? So you said to embed, and again, so many of the people who work in this field will say they created this great strategy, this great initiative, this great program, but then there was a change in leadership or there was another priority and it got left. And if we can take it and embed it in the way we do business, in every policy, in every process, pardon me, we can't lose it. So
yeah. And Marianne, some organizations have allowed that you get some water. Some organizations have allowed Kristin and I will just speak for myself. I shouldn't say this for Kristin, but we did feel a bit disruptive in-house. I don't think that the rock up the hill Kristin described has always been welcome. So if any of your listeners are in that position, it's whatever you need to do personally to have that change happen, right? Is we did have to pick our moments sometimes, right? And sometimes lean into more of the policy or practice, and sometimes get the opportunity to lean into the conversation. But some of our clients have been amazing in letting us, be a bit disruptive in some of the processes they've asked for support with. For example, performance development, not performance management. So what could that look like where it's being done with employees and not to them, right? What would be the risk, right? If you leaned into embedding psych, health, and safety, civility, respect, all of those things into how you set goals, how you plan, how you measure success, and how you develop employees. So we thought you'd ask us about trends, and I would have to say it's not everyone we work with, but we've really seen some courage in some of these more traditional people practices or HR programs or ways of being. Less people looking at best practice, more people asking about what's a next practice.
Yeah, the promising practices. But the other piece that you said, Annika, that I think is a brilliant concept is let's do this with employees, not for employees. And when you read the standard, it's one of the principles is meaningful participation at every level. But the way that you said it, with employees instead of for or to them is brilliant. It's my new catchphrase that I'll go forward with. Kristin, the trend of people being more open to promising practices, to new practices, to thinking about adapting practices for themselves. What other trends have you seen?
Yeah, it's a great question, and some of the trends that we're seeing are just even a shift from. So it goes back to what we were talking about embedding. So when I first started consulting about 4 years ago, I would get requests for, oh, can you do a lunch and learn on this topic? 1 hour, can you teach us how to eradicate unconscious bias? No, well, sure, I can do a lunch and learn, but no, you're not going to leave with bias free. And so one of the trends that we have seen over the last few years is that many organizations are starting to look at things like inclusion and equity within their organizations as a journey. It's not a check the box. We did our lunch and learn. Look at us. We're great. We're racism free. We're bias free. All of these things. It's actually, can we create a learning path for our employees? A suite of learning opportunities over the course of a year or 2 years. And can we connect the dots for them? And that's one of the things that Annika and I really try to do, because we really, really hate to do a one-off session, because we know that, to your point around adult learning, people are maybe inspired or, interested or curious for a day or two, and then they forget what they were taught. So, a lot of organizations now we're really encouraged to see are, asking us for, it's not us saying, hey, you need to embed this. They're starting to say, how do I embed this? We're investing in this 90-minute workshop. How do we bring it to life? So that's one thing that I'm really, happy to see.
That it's evolving. I always say, I love a good question. And I think there's two questions in particular, and I'm curious about yours. I like the question, how will this policy, this discussion, this meeting, this initiative, this interaction impact psychological health and safety. I think that's a great
Yeah.
question but the
Yeah.
other one is, how inclusive is this? And letting
Yes.
people answer that question. Do you have some questions that you love to give to
Yeah,
your
well,
clients?
absolutely. So at the end of our session, well, we ask questions throughout our workshops because it's more fun for us and hopefully more engaging for the person. But yesterday, for example, when we were working with that group, we said, what's the opportunity to foster psychological health and safety in your organization? And they had just created their strategic plan for 2022 to 25. And so we had a slide like, here are your goals. Here are your values. This is, your overarching theme. Now, how does psychological health and safety support that? How does equity, diversity, and inclusion support that? Because it's not that yellow file that sits on the edge of someone in HR's desk. This is something that, to your question earlier to Annika, is it just leadership accountability? No, we all have skin in the game. And so, with this leadership team is, what's your role as a team, but also individually and with your direct reports? So we're, sometimes, and here's the other question that we like to ask when we want to be a little disruptive. We say, especially in particular when we're talking about unconscious bias, could you be wrong about what you believe to be true? And that is often one of those questions where people go, oh, maybe. That's a big question, because that starts to challenge who we are as individuals and what we believe. But we think that these questions are important to pause and ask ourselves and to ask each other. And I will say that if you don't have a focus on psych health and safety, can you have these hard conversations? Will people answer them, authentically?
Yeah. Or be terrified to do so.
Exactly.
One of the things that you talk about, both of you talk about, is accountability. And you've talked a lot about what leaders should be accountable for, but talk to us about how you measure that, how you have that accountability loop. What would you do or recommend so that we know whether they're doing it, whether it's working, whether they need to improve?
Yeah, it's a great question. And these things can be really hard to measure. Annika, did I start talking over you?
I think it's a great question. And certainly, again, referring to my experience in-house, is there was a time when the CEO asked that there be an accountability framework for an over 2,000 person organization. So I have experience, or we have experience on the system side. How do you create that? How does it show up in job descriptions, in performance ratings, in incentives? You can't, receive your, incentive or be successful unless you work cross-functionally, for example. So there's a system side to it. On the softer side, the behavior and mindset, one simple way, Marianne, that we approach it sometimes is to describe the work in terms of the what and the how. So even in organizations where it may be more clear-cut, more black and white, there's more quantitative than qualitative measures, there just tends to be a reliance on the what. If goals are described well, they'll describe what the work is, and there'll be less of an emphasis on how are you going to achieve it. What does that look like? So that's often where we can help, is just get people to describe that how. How would you work individually? How would you work as a team? How would you work together? And when you asked about trends, is do the work you need to do inside, but never lose sight of your clients and your customers and your community. So start to think about that early on. Yes, you need to have inclusive, equitable practices inside. Those translate for sure. But think about your what and your how, internally and externally, and then hold people accountable that there are consequences. If there's no carrot and there's no stick, right, then people can behave, even if you say all the right things about the culture. If they're counterculture and it's condoned, that will undermine your respectful workplace. People will see it. It is, even if it's one individual, two individuals, right? It has an incredibly significant effect if people aren't held accountable and there aren't consequences for that kind of counterculture behavior. And then we find a beautiful thing sometimes happens is if you stay the course, like Kristin said, it's not overnight, but there really is that notion of a tipping point where you attract, recruit, retain people that are successful because they do the what, the way you've described it, and the how that creates an inclusive environment.
Yeah, because the means doesn't always justify the ends.
Exactly.
Yeah.
No, and you see, Marianne, where it's condoned, like sales is a great example. If you have a top salesperson that leaves destruction in their wake, right, for how they achieve those sales, are they untouchable? Is that behavior condoned? And that's just an example. I don't mean to say that it's only in sales, but that's where we love to get in sometimes to say, what are you saying? And then what are you doing? What are you allowing? And what are you rewarding?
Yeah. Yeah. It's a great example, right? And because oftentimes the person may be the highest salesperson, but they're actually having a negative impact on every other salesperson. And therefore the actual impact to the organization is not good. Yeah, great example. Now, I know that this has gone really fast, this whole podcast, but I really want to give a chance, Kristin, for you to tell your story about how you were treated when Annika was your boss.
Yeah. Okay. So this is one of our favorite stories, actually. And it's funny because Annika and I didn't talk about it until probably about 3 years ago. So Annika and I worked in the same organization. She actually hired me. And she was the manager of talent, and she hired me to be a recruiter. This is back in 2007. And early on, I think probably within about the first 6 months that I was there, I started to have a recurrence of depression. So I was diagnosed with depression when I was about 25. So this has been most of my adult life, I've been experiencing this and have tried to, stay in the workplace. I've tried to live my life, with a chronic illness. And sometimes it's been a real challenge in the workplace. And I've had managers that have been, who have actually exacerbated my illness in a really negative way. So this is another reason why psych health and safety and, things like clear leadership and expectations are really personal to me. So Annika is my new manager. We're still getting to know each other after 6 months. She said to me one day, I just noticed that you're not quite yourself lately. And my God, she was right. She had zeroed right in on it. And, typically I'm a pretty, effusive, outgoing person. And so she was starting to pick up on some of the symptoms of my illness. And I was becoming a little bit more withdrawn, and I was tired. I was struggling to stay, to not call in sick, things like that. And so instead of Annika just making a judgment about, oh, well, she doesn't care about this. This was a bad hire. Like, what's her problem? I'm going to have to performance manager. She said that very simple sentence. And because I didn't feel any judgment from her, because she didn't say, and again, this is like your question earlier, like, how do you approach these conversations? Is it the language you use or, your style or approach? And because she wasn't like, you don't seem yourself lately, I definitely felt the empathy and the curiosity and the caring. I was able to, figuratively and probably literally exhale and say, yeah, you're right. And I have depression and I'm kind of struggling with it right now. So I felt like, okay, this is actually a safe space for me. I have not felt that with all my managers. There have been some pretty horrific managers that have, as I said, exacerbated my illness. But it wasn't until a few years ago when we started consulting together that we actually sat down and had this conversation. And I said, I will never forget that day because I felt seen and heard. And so Annika has, she said to me, well, this is how I felt. And so I think we use this scenario, this real life story a lot when we're doing workshops, because we want to tell people we've experienced it. And this is what we want to share with you. So Annika, you share your half now.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks, Marianne, for the space to do this. I hope it's helpful to others. And it was so fascinating to hear each other's perspective that many years later. I, was able to admit to Kristin that, I hesitated. I didn't know what the right words. I didn't want to overstep. I didn't want my words to have any judgment. And certainly leaders have told us that they get a bit stuck that way too, right? And so I imperfectly, uttered that sentence to her. And I'm glad that she picked up on every ounce of my being was purely in a place of curiosity, not judgment. I was so nervous that I wouldn't ask it right. And then I wouldn't know what to do with the response, when I got it. So for me, I was so glad we had that conversation to close that loop, because even though the outcome, I was better able to support her, was a good one, I had always wondered, how that came across. And I was early enough in my journey as a leader and a manager that I didn't have even the skills I have now. There's one phrase, I think you asked Kristin some of the questions we ask our clients, but there's also mantras and things that we run in our own minds in order to do this work. And my number one, Kristin knows, is, what don't I know? I've found that to be so freeing in my personal life and my professional life, but I was still a young enough manager that I still felt I had to know more than I believe I need to know now.
Yeah.
So if I did that well at all, I'm always so grateful when Kristin says that story, but we just want people to lean into that discomfort. Doing it imperfectly is better than not asking at all. We absolutely believe that. But now that I'm older and hope wiser, is any of those situations where I think something is at play that I don't fully understand, I just run that what don't I know in my mind, and then I can lean in and I can find some words to explore this with whomever I'm sitting with.
So Kristin and Annika, it's been a pleasure talking to you and learning from you and being inspired by you. I've got one final question for you, and that is, how would you describe a psychologically healthy and safe workplace to somebody who has no idea what it is? And I don't want the actual legal definition. What I want from you is a description that anybody would understand.
Sure. I like to just say that a psychologically healthy and safe workplace is a workplace where you feel valued, where you feel seen and heard, and you feel a sense of belonging. So you don't have to, hold back. You can be your true self, whatever that might mean. But a psychologically safe and healthy workplace, you feel it. You feel it.
That's great. Thank you. Annika?
Yeah, I know trust is different and it's a byproduct of it, but it's certainly an important element for me that you feel that trust. And I love that Kristin went to feel. It is subjective. So I think, one of the things that you can't decree it into existence, right? You can't tell people that they feel it or that they're experiencing it. So be okay with people describing it differently, even as we just have, and experiencing it differently. That shouldn't be daunting. It's still something that you can create collectively.
Yeah. And just checking in with people.
Yes.
What's that feel like for you? And that it can change from day to day.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Well, thank you both so much. This podcast will be on Psych Health and Safety in Canada.com website. It will also be on the Flourish DX YouTube channel. And I will get snippets of your brilliance, and we'll have some of those clips on LinkedIn, and I'll certainly let you know when that's out and about. So thank you so much for being part of this.
Thank you, Marianne. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you.
Yeah, thank you, Marianne.
You've been listening to the Psych Health and Safety Canada podcast. To stay up to date with the best content on workplace mental health in North America, subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts and join the Flourish DX community at www.flourishdx.com.